Um, Welcome to everyone, near and far. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be in the world. Dr. Lara Susan Golodisarki, the founder and executive director of the Center for Migration, Gender, and Justice. And on behalf of the organization, I would like to welcome you to this event, Perspectives from the Field, a multi-stakeholder dialogue. This event is part of this year's Global Gender and Migration Forum, a shared global commons connecting knowledge, policy, and practice on migration and gender. As a multi-stakeholder mechanism, the forum facilitates collaboration across sectors and geographies, centering migrants' lived experiences and perspectives. And that's exactly what today's event is about. And it plays a central role. So we are very excited to learn from our colleagues here today. We also hope that you might consider joining us for additional events that are happening throughout the forum, and we'll be providing more information later session. I will pass it now to the moderator of today's discussion, Cristina Ciordia, a dear colleague of mine and human rights advocate and expert. Cristina.
Hi, Lara Susan. Good morning and good afternoon to those joining us. Thank you very much for your invitation and for having us all here today. My name is Cristina Ciordia. I'm very pleased to moderate this conversation as a part of the Global Gender and Migration Forum, and I'm honored to be a part of this event for another year. I was there a few years ago at Fordham when you first launched it, and it was very exciting. In today's session of Perspectives from the Field is grounded in a simple but really critical premise, just that migration governance cannot be effective or just if disconnected from lived realities, from lived experience of migrants. While global frameworks are increasingly recognizing the gendered dimensions of migration, at least on paper, there is a persistent gap between the policy commitments and what women and girls are actually experiencing in as migrants. This conversation is an invitation to narrow that gap, and all of us work in different ways in narrowing that gap by centering voices that are often underrepresented in global spaces, and with this bringing nuance and context and the richness of lived experience to the conversation. We'll hear today from scholars, practitioners, and advocates working across different regions and contexts, from South Asia to Ukraine, Afghanistan, and the United States, bringing insights from their own fieldwork, research, and even their own lived experience and realities. As we move on to the discussion, I'd like to invite us all to listen for the common threads and also the important differences across contexts, and maybe to keep in mind a guiding question that I think could help us through our thinking of the experiences that we're about to listen to, which is what shifts when we truly center perspectives from the field, lived experiences. What shifts in how migration policies are designed and implemented? This is a bit of an imagination exercise that I'm asking us all to do. So we will jump right ahead. As we know, we have 10 minutes per speaker. And as I mentioned to them, I will try to keep us on schedule. That's perhaps the most annoying part of the job of the moderator. But like I said before, because I'm nice, people tend to forgive me if I need to cut them off. I hope that won't be the case. And I look forward to listening to you all. We are gonna start off with Nikita Aggarwal, whose work centers the intersections of gender, migration, and labor, particularly among low-wage immigrant women workers. Nikita is a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland School of Social Work, whose research and practice center gender migration, workplace victimization, and behavioral health among low-wage immigrant workers. Using quantitative and mixed method approaches in partnership with community organizations, she examines migration-related trauma and labor exploitation through structural, environmental, and gender justice lenses. Nikita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Cristina, and thank you all for being here. Just give me a second while I share my screen. I promise the presentation is not super long, but it's something to help me show you my work as well as what can you see so far?
We can
And
see
First,
a folder with your downloads
ah,
folder.
okay, let me try again.
No problem.
Okay, I think you now see my PowerPoint.
Yes, yes, we can now see your PowerPoint.
Perfect. 1 second. There you go. All right, welcome everybody. So, as you know, I'm Nikita, and I'm currently a PhD candidate at University of Maryland. So, what I'm presenting today is a part of my dissertation, but also a 2-year-long research that's now coming to its endpoint. So, this presentation is focused on understanding the dynamics from migration to the workplace, basically looking at labor precarity and mental health. Completely understudied area when we talk about South Asian immigrant women restaurant workers who are part of the essential workforce here in the US. Okay. So this study conceptualizes labor coercion not as extreme or isolated events, but as embedded in the everyday organization of restaurant work. In this sector, informal labor practices, weak enforcement of protections, employer control over schedules and wages create conditions where, um, you know, coercion becomes normalized. And these dynamics are also gendered, especially when it comes to South Asian immigrant women who are often concentrated in lower wage, less visible roles, where expectations around flexibility, deference, and care work shape how they experience and respond to workplace demands. And at the same time, migration related constraints such as documentation, legal status, or even limited job mobility further reduce workers' ability to negotiate or even leave exploitative conditions. So these experiences are structured at the intersection of ethnicity, class, gender, nationality, legal status, or what have you, where workers are simultaneously racialized, economically dependent, and institutionally constrained. So let's look at what the study examines. The study focuses on South Asian immigrant restaurant workers more broadly, while paying particular attention to how these experiences are shaped by gender. It examines how conditions across the migration trajectory, particularly from pre migration context to post migration work and living environments, shape workers' everyday lives. A key aspect of this study is that it centers workers' own voices. They look at how workers define their stresses. What does mental health and coping look like for women workers? While many of these conditions are shared across workers, the analysis highlights how they're experienced differently by women, particularly in relation to job roles, expectations, and constraints around mobility. So, this allows the study to capture both the broader realities of restaurant work and the gender dimensions within it. So, a quick study overview. It was an ethnographically informed and qualitatively driven concurrent as quantitative study driven by the participants themselves. I partnered with a worker center named Restaurant Opportunities Center in New York and DC, and that the study sites were cities in New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. It involved a lot of collaboration with Worker Center, not just for recruitment, but to actually understand what are the unique needs and issues that the women workers in this workforce are facing. Restaurant work, as you know, is one of the most predominant industries in the US, Canada, and global developed economy. So understanding the role of immigrant workers who are overrepresented in this workspace becomes even more important. So for many women, migration was shaped not only by economic need, but also by gendered forms of vulnerability. Many participants reported fleeing intimate partner violence, political instability, or fleeing their countries of origin because of debt or financial pressure, either from the families or a socioeconomic environment. So these conditions then influenced why they decided to migrate, the urgency with which women sought work after arrival. And many women reported that the only work that they were available was in low-wage work, such as restaurant, that may not match the skills they have previously attained in their country of origin, which in this study was Nepal, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, India, Bangladesh. And as you can see, in this context, restaurant work often became the most immediate and accessible form of employment. As one of my participants said, restaurant jobs are the only available jobs for women like us. My degree doesn't matter here. Another woman said, front jobs are only for white or those who live here. It took me years to come to front house. This worker started off as a dishwasher as she was an undocumented status. And after 15 years of service, she finally was in the front of the house job role, aka a server. Let's look at gender workplace coercion. So within the workplace, women describe not just difficult conditions, but distinctly gendered forms of control and harassment. This included unpaid wages or paying less than what they were promised or deducting their tips. But also everyday experiences of verbal abuse, inappropriate jokes, and comments on their bodies. And these were often subtle, normalized, and embedded in daily interactions, whether it's with the employer or with the customers, or even with co-workers of different ethnicities or gender, rather than recognized as formal complaints. This reflects how gendered expectations, racialization, and power operate together, where women are not only controlled as workers, but also evaluated and disciplined to their bodies. One of my participants shared, my manager speaks in another language when I enter the room and makes comments about my body, saying I should eat less to run faster around work. Let's look at the accumulated, how these accumulated stressors then impact the daily mental health and coping experiences of these women. So women describe mental health through everyday experiences such as exhaustion, constant worry, sleep, not being able to sleep, not being able to eat, feeling overwhelmed, often tied to both work demands of being an immigrant worker and the ongoing family responsibilities, whether it's long distance or immediate. And these experiences were shaped by a gendered sense of responsibility where women continued to manage emotional and caregiving roles across distance, even while working long and demanding hours. And in terms of coping, women describe like they ended up buying phones from limited salary that they have to stay in touch with their children, to call home. And that was one of the important ways to manage their stress. They also relied on peer support, forming connections with coworkers, and even spending time with friends when possible. And in one of the few cases, religion and faith were often key sources of support. So just some of the few implications as I wrap up, I want to highlight. These findings point to the need for responses that go beyond individual employer, individual workplaces. For practice, worker centers plays a critical role, not just in addressing labor violations, but as spaces for rights-based education, training, and peer support, and even intervention in exploitative work conditions. There's also a need for stronger participation with immigrant serving organizations that can provide more holistic support and include mental health services. And from a policy perspective, this includes strengthening grievance mechanisms, especially for women workers with precarious immigration status. What's needed, to answer Cristina's question, is a shift from managing outcomes to restructuring systems, centering immigrant women's voices in migration governance, strengthening labor protections, and investigating in worker-led and community-based supports. Improving immigrant workers' health requires not only addressing workplace conditions, but investigating in the system that support women workers' rights, stability, and everyday rights. And that's it for my time. Thank you for your eyes and ears. Thank you for listening. And this is my contact details if any one of you wish to get in touch. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Nikita, so much for sharing the important work that you're doing. I find that these immigrant spaces or immigrant majority spaces are incredibly important places where to do research because the experience is not individual but communal, and that really affects how or these relationships really affect how the experience is overall lived. And they are very transformational in terms of potential for policy because they are community spaces. So I think it's really important, the work that you're doing, and I'm happy to have learned about it.
Thank you so
We
much.
will now we will now hear from Neveen Aboeldahab, whose research explores questions of belonging, identity, and community making in diaspora. Neveen is a PhD candidate and teacher fellow at Ibn Haldoun University. Her research focuses on migration, belonging, identity, post-colonial studies, and the sociology of religion. She's focusing on themes of liminality, belonging, identity, and placemaking in diaspora. She holds a master's degree in sociology, and her ethnography studies focus on uncovering the sensitive narratives of marginalized groups. Neveen, would love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Cristina, for the introduction. I will go straight into the topic. So based on what you said, this study was drawing on my 12-month of ethnographic field work in Istanbul. I investigated the experience of Arab migrant women in navigating the state of liminality, with particular focus on the socio-cultural practices and also socio-religious practices. I dug into the subtleties of what it's like to be an Arab migrant woman in Istanbul, exploring emotional and symbolic significance of homemaking in diaspora. So when we discuss immigration and gender, we often speak in terms of vulnerability, in particular as we live in an anti-era migrant, where migrants treated as a transient or as a problem to be solved. But when we step into the field, specifically the living rooms of Istanbul, the narrative changed. My research investigated how Arab migrant women navigated prolonged liminality, that is the exhausting state of being neither here nor there, feeling of the uncertainty, the partial belonging, and ongoing transition as they navigate their lives in the city. What they describe is often theorized in sociology as liminality, as you said, a state of betwixt and between, where one is detached from a previous life, but not yet woven into a new one. Also, my research investigates how the fear of exclusion, marginalization shape the life experiences of minorities and communities. My study revealed that this fear drives some Arab migrant women to search for the meaning of home and cultural intimacy in specific places and organize community gathering that serve as a space of connection. I will give an example later about these places. And I will also highlight the impact of these places on these Arab migrant women in terms of sense of community, sense of belonging, and sense of existence, maybe, that I exist. What I found in my in-depth interviews and extensive participant observation was a sophisticated form of social architecture. What I mean here by social architecture is that they build, construct, and shape this concept or meaning of home in diaspora. These women are the primary initiators of social communal gathering, such as Majlis and Sufi gathering. Majlis is a type of informal communal gathering, often organized by the Arab migrant women. Sufi gathering is a religious gathering, typically led by a spiritual guide and involve religious chanting in a calm devotional setting. In these spaces, they perform what I call the act of remembering. They aren't just remembering about the past, they are using ritual, conversation, and shared space to mend the home that was interrupted by exile, war, political difficulty, or other reasons. By reclaiming the majlis, they transform a liminal void into a site of agency, resilience, and belonging. Today, I want to share how these invisible social infrastructures are, in fact, They are very things keeping the idea of home alive in a diaspora. And thanks to these Arab migrant women, I witnessed how these women, regardless the challenges in the host environment, refuse to be passive and take an active role to maintain a sense of belonging and mending home. Socially, religiously, they were seeking the sense of ummah, maybe sense of community, a solidarity. So the majlis, I won't call them social hubs or social clubs. I prefer to call them social infrastructure to show the deep impact they have on these Arab migrant women. So I would like to share some quotes from these Arab migrant women. For example, this young lady shared, "Home is where I can be myself. In these events, I can breathe." Another lady shared, "I feel myself here not as a migrant. I freely, without any constraints, practice my identity." In these places, participants regain feeling of coherence, draw on common cultural codes, and reinforce identities that frequently conceal where in larger public places. They have become sites where belonging is actively navigated and established through daily rituals for women otherwise treated as transient, as I mentioned earlier. Breath of fresh air. This statement or this quote still echoes in my head when one migrant woman shared. And when I first attended one of these gatherings, I understood what she meant. Everyone was sharing the stories of what brought them here, and these moments of storytelling reveal a shared condition of uncertainty between past and present lives. Yet, the act of sharing stories was also transformative. As the women narrated their journeys, they began to name and reclaim a sense of self that displacement had unsettled. So this search for home is not simply a nostalgic dream, it is a practical struggle for safety and belonging in a world that often treats migrants as temporary visitors. However, the women I spent time with in Istanbul prove that they are actively constructing it through their everyday practices. I would like also here to highlight the resilience and resistance I found in these women behaviors, activities. For migrants, the concept of home goes beyond a physical space. It is defined by the ability to form meaningful emotions and social bonds in a new setting. This shift is not just an academic theory, it's survival strategy. My conversation with Arab women migrant highlighted their resilience as they navigate new realities. I discovered that places where people interact influence how they rebuild their identities and create a sense of home in diaspora. Let's not also forget some women have migrated alone and have no family, no roots here in the new host setting. They need something to remind them or to connect them to home or at least to who they really are. I remember this quote from one Arab migrant woman. She said, "I want more than just a friendship circle. I'm looking for something to replace the sensation of large family, which I disconnected from, especially in special occasions like wedding ceremonies, funerals, or big occasions. They look for this feeling." Also, religion is an important aspect for these women. Faith is not just a belief, it's a physical shield and refuge. For these women, religion provides emotional grounding needed to survive in the diaspora. I believe this can be my final remark. I believe we must stop looking at migrants through the lens of what they lack and start seeing them from the social engineering they provide. I will refer back to what I said, social architecture of what they are capable of constructing and establishing and what they are capable of doing. To respond to the general question, what we need, I believe what we need, we must also switch the gaze from assimilation, integration, and provide these migrant women with what actually they need. They need a community that ties them to home and to their own identity. Thank you. I think I finished with my words.
Thank you so much, Neveen, for for your words. Our speakers are using a little less than their allotted time, which is great because it'll give us time to get more questions after. It really stayed with me, the quote that you shared about this person who's looking for something that'll replace the feeling of a large family, because I feel that very deeply. That is part of my experience as well. I'm Venezuelan, and we have, big, loud Latina families, and I'm still looking for the, I don't want to use the word replacement, but the thing that'll make me feel that way. Um, and I really like the fact that you have both so far, Nikita and yourself, shared quotes. I think that the that listening to this little extracts of the things that these women say is so powerful because we connect with those kinds of words in a different way than we do with the analysis and the trends and the policy, all of which is important, is the world I live in too. But these little nuggets of their own voice, I think, are really powerful, and I thank you for sharing them.
Thank you. Just one more thing. I'm sorry, Cristina.
You have time. You used 50 minutes less, so you have time.
What I liked about the event, like perspective from the field, I really like that we hear, I'm sure that my colleagues also will do the same, sharing from the field, which we really need. Like we read about these theories, we discuss it, we analyze it, but sharing from the field, going deep into the field is really change the narratives. Now we have these stereotypes or whatever we have like for a long time ago, but like we have new voices now, we have new narratives. So sharing from the feed, I believe it's very, very important. So thank you for allowing this, and thank you for calling it perspective from the field.
I think that's an important contribution. Thank you. We will now hear from Moschda Ebrahimi. Moschda's work brings both academic and lived perspectives on migration, particularly in relation to Afghan women in Germany. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Cologne. Her research focuses on Afghan women in Germany and their experiences of migration, belonging, and social change. She has worked with refugee women for several years and also speaks from her own experience as an Afghan woman. Moschda, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Cristina. As you mentioned, my name is Moschda Ebrahimi. I'm a PhD candidate in social and cultural anthropology at the University of Cologne here in Germany. Yes, my research focuses on Afghan women in Germany and how they experience migration, belonging, and social changes. I also worked like 6 years as a social worker with refugee women, and I speak from my own perspective as an Afghan woman living in Germany. I'm currently preparing interviews with Afghan women in Germany as part of my research, and my perspective connects lived experience with broader discussions on migration policies. In my work as social worker, I often saw very clearly what women really needed in their everyday lives. For example, they needed recognition of their qualification that they brought from home, support in learning the language in a practical way and not the language classes that we offer here in Germany. And the language classes there are not for everybody, just for few countries. And they also need help with this complex system here in Germany, because even I live like 30 years here in Germany, but I still get confused with all the laws and the system here. So it's not really easy to go along and find a way here. But many of them needed also emotional support, because migration is not also a practical challenge, but also a personal one. So this is a point that most of the people don't see, and especially here in Germany, they say we don't really have enough of therapists for all the women to get a therapy or whatever they need emotionally. So this aspect is not a big aspect over here. But I also experienced that these needs were not always taken seriously, especially when there was no formal or academic evidence behind them. So that's why I decided to do my PhD, because I had the field work. I worked for many years with this woman, and I wanted to connect them to research. So many women who came to Germany, especially after 2021, had a life before. They studied in Afghanistan, they worked, they had responsibilities. Some were teachers, journalists, or worked in other professional fields. During the past years, there were more opportunities for Afghan women to have opportunities in work and education in Afghanistan. So they built something over the time. They didn't just build careers, but also identities connected to their role in the society with their careers. And this is important to understand because they didn't came here empty. They came with knowledge, they came with experience and a sense of who they are. But after migration, much of this is no longer recognized. Their qualifications are often not accepted. Their experience is not seen. So for many women, migration is not only a new beginning, it is also a process of loss, a loss of status, a loss of recognition, and often also loss of belonging. That's why many women feel invisible and not taken seriously. And at the same time, they faces a lot of challenges like language barriers, complex system, as I mentioned, gender expectations, and sometimes also a lot of discriminations. So even if they have skills and experience, these are not easily recognized in the new context. This also shows a gap between policy framework and everyday realities. Yeah, in my work as a social worker, I saw many situations like this. For example, I remember an Afghan woman who was a teacher in Afghanistan for many years, and she had to flee Afghanistan and come to Germany because the situation in Afghanistan with women, we all know about it, sadly. So she had in Afghanistan experience and confidence and everything, but in Germany, she had to start from the beginning. She had to learn the language, go through different steps, and prove herself again and again. And at some point, she said something that really stayed with me. She said, "Since I'm here, I feel like I lost not only my job, but also who I am." And I think this shows something very important because it's not only about work, it's about identity, it's about recognition, and it's about belonging. In the German context, this often becomes very visible. Many women have to go through long process of recognition. Sometimes their degrees, they're not accepted at all or only partly. So even if they had strong professional roles before, they often have to start again in low-paid jobs or training programs. Or sometimes they have to wait for several years until they can start working again. And this takes years of their life that they are not able to do anything but sit and wait. But this is not the whole picture. I experienced also with the woman that I interview for my research that these women are not only passive, they try to rebuild their lives here. They learn the language, they find their way through the system, they support each other and families, and they find new ways to move forward. Often in very small and baby steps. And they're often also not being seen, but they start still to do something new or to rebuild a new life. In my research, I call this repositioning. It means finding a new place in a new society, even when the starting point is shaped by loss. But this takes time and it requires a lot of strength. At the same time, many system focus mainly, or the German system focus mainly on what people do not have. For example, missing language, missing certification, or missing formal qualification. But less attention is given to what people already bring. And this creates a problem because women are often seen only as people in need, not as people with knowledge, experience, and strength. So I think we need to change how we look at this and we need to listen more carefully and we need to take this experience seriously. For me, this is not only about integration or migration. It is about dignity, it is about recognition, it is about belonging. If you want more inclusive migration governance, we need to listen more carefully to the lived experiences. I think this was a little bit too fast. But if you have any other questions, please let me know.
Thank you very much, Moschda. And like I said, it's great that you guys are actually taking a little bit less time because that'll allow us to move to the best part, which is always to exchange with one another. We have heard sort of the basis, and then we can ask questions. Lara Susan actually included one in the chat already that hopefully we'll get to after we have heard the rest of our speakers. Your work spoke to me in a particular way, Moschda, because I lived in Germany for a few years and volunteered at a refugee organization, and these themes are just unfortunately so stagnant. Like that, this was 10 years ago, and 2016, it was the height of that wave. And yeah, I hear so many things that you mentioned that were part of that experience, and thinking like we feel like we have made all of these strides, and we have in some ways, we have, but in other ways, at the individual level, the individual experience, it's still so heavy in all of these different ways. And it's this gap that we've referred to from the beginning, like great for policy advancements, but when are we going to make sure that these advancements get to the people who are actually at the center of them? So thank
Right.
you for what you shared.
Thank you.
We will now turn to Tetiana Drakokhrust, who brings a critical legal perspective on wartime migration and experiences of displaced Ukrainian women. Tanya is a legal scholar and doctor of law specializing in migration, international protection, and human rights. She works at the Department of Theory of Law and Constitutionalism, West Ukrainian National University Faculty of Law, focusing on European integration and Ukrainian wartime migration. She participates in international conferences and contributes to research and policy-oriented legal analysis. We would like to hear from you, Tetiana.
Thank you. I'm very flattered to be here, and also it's like let it say, both an honor and responsibility for me to contribute to this discussion and to reflect on the experiences of Ukrainian women in the context of war and, unfortunately, forced migration. So I have prepared like not so long presentation, but I suppose so it will be easier for you just to look exactly and follow my speech. Then, what exactly I want to point out? Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has triggered one of the largest displacement crises in Europe, as all you are, yes, exactly, informed in recent decades. And importantly, the majority of those forced to flee are women, often traveling with children or caring for other family members. And as one Ukrainian woman described her experience, so I left my home for safety, but I did not feel secure. So that is the main message that we are talking about. And what does it mean? This makes gender not a secondary factor, but a central lens through which migration must be understood. So within this presentation, I would like to focus on the legal and practical challenges faced by Ukrainian women in wartime migration. As you may see, an important and often overlooked dimension is the gendered nature of displacement itself. So due to martial law, many men are not allowed to leave Ukraine, which means that women often migrate alone with children. As a result, they assume full responsibility for family survival and integration in a foreign country. This, as a consequence, this creates a specific form of a gendered vulnerability that shapes their legal and social position from the very beginning. As all we know, basically, first, the EU temporary protection framework has provided fast and essential access to safety, and it has been without doubt a crucial emergency response. However, formal legal rights do not always translate into real opportunities. In practice, many women face structural barriers to employment, housing, and of course, social integration. For example, like a woman with a young child may formally have access to the labor market, but in reality be unable to work due to lack of childcare. What exactly does it mean? This illustrates a broader issue. Legal entitlement does not automatically ensure effective access to exact rights that we are all talking about. And from the legal perspective, this points to a gap between formal protection and substantive equality. So while the temporary protection framework provides immediate legal status, it does not fully address the structural inequalities that shaped women's everyday experiences. Then, what exactly that I just wanted to show you in this slide. Talking about then another important challenge is the skilling. Many Ukrainian women nowadays who previously worked as professionals, including teachers, lawyers, or even doctors, are unable to access jobs matching their qualification due to recognition barriers and also language requirements. As a result, they are often employed in low-skill sectors, yes, which affect their long-term integration and economic independence. Second one, displacement has significantly increased of the risk of exploitation. Women who lack stable income, secure housing, or knowledge of the local language may find themselves in particularly vulnerable situations. These risks are not hypothetical because, as you may see, also there are concrete official reports that we can all investigate if we want. Basically, within international organizations, such as you may see on this slide, they state that there are repeatedly warned about trafficking risks affecting Ukrainian women since 2022. And there have already been documented cases across Europe, for instance, confirmed cases involving Ukrainian women were reported in France. In countries such as Germany, NGOs also have raised concerns about women being drawn into exploitative situations due to lack of housing or employment situations. Also, researchers also show that vulnerability often begins at the earliest stages of displacement. In countries like Poland or Romania, women have relied on informal offers of transport, accommodation, or work, which in some cases have led to labor exploitation as a result. What exactly does it mean? This highlights a key point. Basically, legal protection does not always mean actual safety. In that, other words, what exactly we can say here? That there is a clear distinction between being legally protected and being effectively protected in everyday life. These challenges should also be understood through the intersectional lens. So gender interacts with other factors such as displacement status, economic vulnerability, and caregiving responsibilities, creating layered forms of disadvantage. And third, care responsibilities play a crucial but often invisible role. As all we understand, many displaced Ukrainian women carry the primary burden of child care and family support. This responsibility significantly limits their ability to work, integrate, and access opportunities. In this sense, care is not only a private issue, but also a structural barrier embedded in migration, basically reality. Finally, the temporary nature of protection creates long-term uncertainty. So living under temporary status makes it difficult to plan for the future, build stable career, or ensure continuity in children's education. In response to these challenges, the European Union has taken important steps, of course, we are all aware, who have been investigating this issue. So there is a targeted anti-trafficking plan, of course, and it is introduced. There are initiatives that aim to identify and protect vulnerable individuals at an early stage. However, their effectiveness depends on consistent implementation across countries. This results in uneven levels of protection across the European Union, where access to rights may vary significantly depending on the host country. So to conclude, basically, the key challenge is not only to provide protection, but to ensure that this protection is meaningful, accessible, and sustainable. The case of Ukrainian women clearly shows that gender-neutral migration policies are not sufficient in times of crisis. What is needed is a shift from temporary and reactive solutions toward long-term, gender-responsive legal frameworks that recognize both agency and vulnerability. Only then can migration governance truly ensure inclusion, equality, and dignity for those affected by forced displacement. Thank you. I was trying to be short, but I suppose so effective.
And that you were. Thank you very much, Tetiana, for your words. During CSW a few months ago, we talked so much about something that you mentioned, which was the importance of stability and the damning effects that uncertainty has on this process. At that point, we were talking about it in terms of regularization, but this actually applies to a lot more because the damaging effect of uncertainty in the different parts of this process really cannot be understated. And I liked how you post that, and also this important tension that you highlighted between recognizing both agency and vulnerability, like not having victim-centered look on migration at this people who need protecting from, because they are people with agency and with dignity, and this should never be striped. But at the same time, the importance of recognizing vulnerability within the condition strikes what seems to be a very hard balance, but that it's actually, I think, to those of us who work with this day in and day out, the only real way to do it. So I really appreciated that element of your presentation. And now we will hear, right before moving on to our awaited Q&A, we still have a last speaker that we are honored to hear from, who is Moschda Rahbar. Muzhda's work bridges youth advocacy, policy, and global platforms, bringing an important perspective on participation and leadership. She is an Afghan youth advocate and policy practitioner engaged with United Nations aligned programs, including SDSN's Global School Programs, UNICEF Champion Network, and the UN Major Group for Children and Youth. Her work advances SDG implementation, gender-responsive policy, and youth participation, with leadership spanning education systems, climate action, and transnational advocacy initiatives. Moschda, would love to hear from you.
Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you, to wherever you are, and thanks so much for inviting me. I'd like to put my perspective on migration through a gender lens, not only the human attrition issue, but as a question of rights, agency, and structural inequality. Now, migration is often discussed in natural terms, but in reality, it is deeply shaped by gender, women and girls experience displacement within the pre-existing systems of inequality, legal, economic, and social, which are then intensified by conflict and crisis. This means that migration is not just movement across borders, it is also a transformation of risk, access, and power. And there is a growing tension between the knowledge and lived realities, between the policy expertise and field experience. There's a saying that goes, scholars cannot address the realities of displacement and migration solely through the frameworks they have mastered in books. Lived experiences often reveal the dimensions that theory alone cannot fully capture. And I feel like that really lives up the name of this event. And this is why, like, spaces like this matter because they attempt, at least in principle, to bridge that gap between the knowledge production and the realities to ground them. And first, moving on, the legal status remains a central determinant of women's access to rights. While international frameworks such as the 1951 Refugee Convention and the CEDAW establish protections, there is often a significant gap between the formal commitments and lived realities of the people who go beyond borders. Displaced women frequently face barriers related to documentation, residency status, and recognition of their claims, especially when gender based prosecution is not adequately acknowledged. As a result, access to healthcare, education, and legal remedies becomes conditional and uneven. And as one displaced woman described that, I have rights on paper, but without documents, those rights don't reach me. And I feel like that really is like mostly the case for all of them. And I really highlight that the gap between the formal rights and lived realities is really sky different. Secondly, protection challenges must be understood in both public and private spheres. Women in displacement are exposed to heightened risks of gender based violence, exploitation, and economic dependency. However, protection is not only about emergency responses, it is also about the long term safety, dignity, and autonomy. Weak reporting systems, social stigma, and lack of trust in institutions continue to limit access to justice. Now, in many cases, women express this reality clearly, saying that even when something happens, you stay silent because speaking out can make your situation worse. And because it's really, like in real life, it is really like that. They cannot speak out, and that really reflects how the protection mechanisms often fail in practice. And at the same time, it is important to challenge the dominant narrative that frames migrant women primarily as victims. Women are not only vulnerable, they are also agents of resilience, community builders, and economic contributors. Across different contexts, we see women leading households, support informal economics, and sustaining social networks and diaspora. And as one migrant woman expressed, saying that we are not surviving here, we are holding our families and communities together. I have been in contact with many migrant women, and believe it or not, they are really holding the whole thing together by themselves. And ignoring this agency leads to the policies that are protective in intention but restrictive in outcome. A critical issue in the gap between the policy design and implementation is that many migration policies lack gender sensitivity, but not because of the absence of the frameworks, but due to insignificant integration of the intersectional realities such as age, class, and cultural context. In addition to them, displaced women are rarely included in decision making processes, which limits the relevance and the effectiveness of policy responses. As also emphasized in the Global Compact for Migration, gender responsive approaches require not only inclusion but accountability in implementation. And I don't think without localizing particularly approaches, even well-designed policies fail to do, like they would fail to have a meaningful impact. And from a context like Afghanistan, we see how restrictions on women's mobility, education, and employment can directly shape migration patterns. In such environments, migration may become not only a survival strategy, but also one of the few pathways to regain autonomy. And the need to connect the migration policy with the broader issues of gender justice and structural inequality. And in conclusion, addressing the migration through a gender lens requires moving beyond protection alone. It requires recognizing women as right holders and decision makers, ensuring that access to justice and designing the policies that reflect lived realities rather than assumptions. And ultimately, the gender responsive migration is not just about managing displacement. It is about advancing equity, dignity, and sustainable resilience. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Moschda, also for joining us, even though circumstances are less than ideal for you right now. It means a lot that you're showing this commitment to the event and that you want to share your perspective with all of us. There's something that or a quote again that you mentioned that again brought me back to what we were discussing in CSW, because of course this makes sense, right? This was also a CMGJ event, and the topics that we're bridging are always around the same topic. But when you mentioned this woman who said that she knows that she has rights on paper, but without documents, those rights don't reach her, I was reminded of something that I mentioned in one of these events, saying that when you learn human rights in school or at any point in your education where you're introduced to this concept, the first thing that they will teach you is that human rights are interdependent and indivisible, and there's no right that's more important than another, and that they're all at the same level. But as a practitioner, the very first thing that you learn is that that is not true, and that documents and the right to identity is actually a gateway right to other rights, just like access to justice is a gateway right to other rights, because if you can't access justice, then you can't defend yourself when your rights have been violated. And if you don't have documents, then you don't have access to get there. So it's not true that all rights are the same, interdependent, indivisible, just as important as the other. And we see this in everyday practice. And when people mention this, you might think of things like, yes, of course, right to life is most important, because if without life, you don't have anything else, or water. If without water, you don't have anything else. And those things are true. But the reality of the exercise and enjoyment of rights is actually even more complicated that this very basic ideas of like, sure, life is most important. It's actually, of course, you have to be alive, but you also have to have papers to prove that you're alive, to be able to access justice systems. And just knowing that we have to start there, especially in migration context where you could have had those documents in a different context, but they're not translating to your host country or to the place where your feet are currently touching the ground, is incredibly important and is an integral part of migration and gender justice. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for sharing their work, their research, the work that they're doing, and the voices that they are bringing, the perspectives that they are sharing with us. I am thrilled to see that we already have questions and comments on the chat. I would like to start with bringing the question that Lara Susan first put forth, which was, how do we move from the field to the policy debates? What are some challenges that you have faced in your work, and how can we collectively overcome them? I think I'll mention maybe 3 questions at this point and then give a chance to answer. And then I would also like, if any of the people present would like to open their mics and ask their questions, I would encourage you to do so while keeping your interventions, please, brief so that we can hear from the speakers. So we have a first question, which I've already announced that it's on the chat, which was from Lara Susan. Essentially, what are some challenges that you have faced in your work, and how can we work to overcome them in terms of moving from the field to policy debates? So basically bringing these voices that you have reflected today to policy debates. There is also a question by Snehal, where she says, on the point of documentation in your practice, what are some informal ways or strategies that you have found to work, even if lack of documentation, even when documentation is deemed necessary by authorities? Basically, are there clever workarounds that have worked for you or that you have seen in your experience? And I'll read this third question before we move on to your answers and we repeat this. Sara Soto says, such enriching approaches. Thank you. My questions are for Nikita. How can women migrant workers in vulnerable migration statuses be empowered to access and participate in policy discussions that affect them? And then for Neveen and Moschda, what would it take to shift from assimilationist migration policy frameworks toward approaches that recognize migrant women as political actors and value their collective practices of resistance and community? So I'd like to hear from you for a few minutes, and then we'll move to the rest of the content of the chat. Who wants to take a crack at any of these three questions? Or more than three.
I can
Nikita,
try
go
to
ahead.
answer. Oh, sorry, was there someone else answering? I didn't say.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Not that I can see, at least.
I can start with Lara's question. Thank you for that question, Lara. Something that I repeatedly encountered in my work, both in the US and in India, is that how women, whether it's in low-wage work or with precarious immigration status, or those who are still on the move, transitioning from their host countries to the destination country, is that how they uniquely define their own stressors, needs, and that does not always fit the definition that's set by the policy debates on violation or exploitation. Because every subgroup of immigrant women have their own cultural connotation of how they define their lived experiences. And that's something I feel is so important when we shift from field to policy debates, to not just treat those lived experiences as data, but to keep it central to the policy debates in defining more comprehensively whether there are state policies and national policies on, say, for example, what is a labor violation, what do security threats look like for immigrant women who are voluntarily coming or are forced to flee from their country of origin? I think that is something very central and essential to moving from the field lived realities to policy discussions, because right now what I see and experience is a disconnect, and what the discussions currently are, where they use very jargon oriented language, and that has a mismatch, or they do not speak to the diverse walks of life of women who are impacted by these policies. I hope that answers a bit of your question.
Thank you for that, Nikita. I think it's fascinating the fact that what we're saying essentially is that this is a lot more complicated than they have made it to be so far, a lot more nuanced. It requires a lot more input, and policymakers don't love that because they want it simple, streamlined, efficient, applicable, and it's actually so much more. It requires a lot more work to have respect these cultural differences, understand the different inputs, and that there's no such category as migrant women, or that all of these things need to be contextualized so much more. Lara Susan, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yes, thank you so much, Nikita, for your response to this. My question was prompted because it's something that I'm still trying to figure out, right? I've been in this field for quite a long time, and I pride myself in being a scholar practitioner, but it comes with many challenges in the sense that, sometimes the academic field says, oh, you're too practice oriented, and then the practice field says, oh, this is so academic, as Cristina mentioned, this is so complex. Why are you making this, so complex? For the policy debate that just doesn't work. So I truly appreciate your insights there, and I'm also curious to hear from others, because I would also say it depends on the space. Some spaces might be more open to the more complex realities that are actually reflective of realities, whereas others are not. And as we're heading into the International Migration Review Forum, and I've already been speaking at some of the events, I just see it happening yet again, and I want to better understand how colleagues in this area are also doing it. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Larsa-san. Moschda, would love to hear from you next. Moschda Rahbar, because we have two in the house today.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'd like to answer all of the questions. Is that all right? Because I've been taking some notes. Is that all right if I answer all the questions?
Yes,
Do you
please,
have
go
time?
ahead.
Okay. So for the first question asked, it said, what are some challenges that you have faced in moving from the field work to policy debate? I think it was asked from Lara, but I would like to also answer it. One of the major challenge in the lived experiences from the field are often treated as something called, anecdotal rather than the credible evidence in policy discussions. Just like Laura says, it's like being too much academic, and on the other hand, it just sounds like too much policy action oriented. So the policy making systems usually prioritize the quantitative data in the institutional reports, which sideline the grassroots voices. And they are the key barriers to the, what we call the epistemic bias, narrowing the definition of what counts as the valid knowledge. Another is the limited access, the frontline actors who rarely include in the decision making. And the another one is the translation gaps. The complex realities get the oversimplified in the policy challenge. So to overcome these, I think, I think like promoting co-production models where communities and researchers create evidence together, and using the NGOs and coalitions as bridges to translate the field insights into the policy language. And the last one could be the advocating for the participatory mechanisms where affected groups, especially the migrant women, are directly included in the policy discussions. My answer to the another question that was asked, it said in context where the documentation is required, often unavailable. What informal strategies or workaround have you seen that that actually work? To answer that question, the documentation systems can exclude the marginalized groups, especially the migrant women working in the informal and the in many what do you call it, the precarious conditions, like in response to the practitioners often rely on the adaptive informal strategies such as the community-based record keeping through the trusted local actors, you know collective verification where community networks confirm the identities or experience, and alternative forms of evidence like the audio stories, photos, or the NGO case trackings. However, these are the temporary solutions. The long-term should focus on things like expanding what institutions accept as valid documentation, or making the administrative systems more flexible and context sensitive. And my answer to the third question that was asked would be, empowering. The empowerment should go beyond participation. It should mean real influence. Many systems are, like expecting migrant women to adopt rather than recognizing their agency. And to address this, I would say that shifting from consultation to representation could ensure the migrant women have decision-making roles, or providing political capacity building, including the advocacy skills and legal literacy. Or it could be supporting collective platforms like associations and grassroots movements. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Moschda, for your comprehensive answer and for trying to pack so much, so much different nuggets of knowledge into what you're sharing with us. Somebody else had their hand up. Was it Tetiana? Was it?
It was me.
Okay.
I just
All right.
want to
Let's hear from you.
respond to Lara Susan's question. What are some challenges you faced? Like basically, when I'm talking from my perspective, moving from the field to policy debates requires translating lived experiences and empirical realities into structured legal and policy language. Too often, when we're talking about evidence from the field, remains fragmented or anecdotal. So while policy discussions operate at a high level of abstraction. So that is why one key challenge is the lack of direct channels between field actors and decision-making institutions. So another is the risk that gendered dimensions of migration are treated as secondary rather than structural issues. And there is often insufficient data disaggregation, which makes it difficult to reflect the specific experiences of vulnerable groups, including displaced women. And that is why when we are talking about through the perspective of closer the collaboration between academia, international organization, and policymakers, as well as by promoting gender sensitive data collection and evidence-based policymaking. So that is why ensuring the field like realities informed policy requires institutional openness and then sustained dialogue across all levels of governance. When we are talking about from our own experience, it's a key challenge nowadays because we are drawing a lot of different kind of degrees, draw laws, etc. But we do not pay attention on individuals exactly and how they then can integrate into different cultural and mental environments. And that is the question, are they willing to do so or are they willing to go back when everything gonna be approximately relatively safe? And as a scholar, we can investigate it endlessly, yes. But as policymakers, we cannot do it constantly because there are other issues that need to be involved. And then we are facing the jury all is written on the paper, but de facto, these papers do not have the mechanism of exactly adaptation within real life experience. That's what I'm facing nowadays as a scholar. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tetiana. I'd like to encourage our speakers who are yet to share if they have some reflections that they'd want to add to the conversation, both for the questions that have or that I already post out loud, but also for the one Lara Susan added to the chat that Tetiana just referenced regarding essentially your own experience as a migrant scholar, how that affects your work, how sometimes we find ourselves in this situation too, in this funny position of being a subject of your own kind of research to a degree, and how that informs your work. And there's also, of course, the questions that were posed already. So I'd encourage Moschda and Neveen. Then we can, of course, hear back from our other speakers. Moschda, please.
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. First of all, the first question, I just wanted to mention that it's really important that we don't just talk about the women, but also include them in the policy. And when we do some, I don't know, some laws about women or about migrant women in Germany or anywhere else, we need to really listen to the woman and not just like fill out some papers or do some laws and say this is how it should work, but the reality looks differently, as we all know. So it's really important that we talk with them and not only about them. And the second question was how it is to be also part of the research. And I think it has two ways. In the one hand, it's really good to know a lot about the culture, the traditions, and how to talk to the woman and to get a deeper dive within the interviews and have a closer research field, I would say. But on the other hand, it's really important to also know that just because I have my experience in this country on this field, it's not their experience. So we have to have a distance also still. So it doesn't make it easier, but I think it's really easy to get a closer look or I don't know, to have a better way to get into the research.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. Yes. I was just saying that yes, I see that balance between the distance and also the added perspective of the closeness is an important an interesting one to navigate on the day-to-day of our research and our work. Neveen, would you like to intervene?
Yeah, just a small thing I add to Moschda. What I meant that, for example, what I meant from my speech about moving or switch the gaze from integration and assimilation is that lots of debate and studies have been discussed about assimilation and integration and how they don't work and how migrants in this assimilation and integration lack the agency. So what I mean here, now the agency should be on the top. Both, by the way, not just migrant women, of course, even migrant men, agencies should now be on the top of the discussion. And it's time to reveal the narratives, hear from these migrants in their small activities, for example, in my study, I discussed the daily activities they do. So in these small narratives, it's time to hear from them and put the agency on the top. I may also that to activate this agency, the migrants should be part of the decision making, not just giving decisions on their behalf or talking on their behalf. It's time to hear from them and being a player or a key player in the decision. I would also add something if decision making and policy is really always difficult process, I can the media can play this role. Media can now being into the field and revealing these narratives of the migrants and show and activate this agency or the active role of migrants. This is what I have for this. I hope it answers the questions. This is how I perception this idea of activate the active role and agency of migrants. Sorry, you are muted, Cristina. Sorry.
Jesus, I'm sorry. It's just that my dog started barking before, so I've been muting myself in between. Thank you. I was just saying that the media sure does a lot to perpetuate negative narratives, so it would be great if it started doing a lot to showcase the agency of migrants as well. There was an interesting comment by Francisca in the chat about her own research. She's talking how she focuses on La Cachina, an informal cross-border market in the trade route centered on the circulation of secondhand clothing between Tacna in southern Peru and Arica in northern Chile. In the case of La Cachina, many women traders and commission-based workers survive through the movement of used clothing across the border, which is often categorized as smuggling under current regulation. If public policies simply prohibit these practices without considering their social realities, many of these women would be left without work and without means to support their families, particularly as many are single mothers and primary caregivers. This highlights the need for policies that go beyond prohibition and instead recognize the structural conditions that make these informal economies necessary for survival. So sorry. Yes, this is actually a very interesting case study. If Francisca, if you have anywhere where we can look at your work, I think that would be very interesting. There's ways in which this broad policies such as smuggling, for used clothing on little border can have such an impact on a group of people that I have to believe is not who is meant to be targeted by, anti-smuggling policies. Nikita had asked me to also come back and share about one of the questions that was directed to her, and I think we are almost reaching the end of our time. So after this, I think we can go to Lara Susan for closing remarks. The floor is yours, Nikita.
Thank you. Sarah asked a question about women migrant workers with precarious status and regarding the empowerment of such population. I think, and this is from the conversation I had with a couple of women workers who were undocumented and was struggling between 2 to 3 jobs at once. And something that stayed with me is that women in precarious status need confidential language accessible grievance systems and legal protection so they can speak without risking their livelihoods. And I think that's where empowerment then starts with access and safety. And something to Muzhda's point where she mentioned about how immigration is not just about mobility, but also about the transfer of risk, power, and access. So I think access in that case also depends on the practical supports like childcare, flexible meeting times, and compensation for bringing women to advisory roles. And because participation may remain risky for women with precarious legal statuses or those who are in overall precarious environmental situations. So they need real options to leave exploitative work conditions if they speak up, or if we want empowerment to work that is not just about voice, but about creating conditions where women can participate safely, consistently, and with impactful influence. So thank you for asking that question, Sarah.
Thank you, Nikita. And I thank you all for your important work, for taking the time to share it with us, for the research that you're doing, the questions that you're working so hard to answer, and most importantly, perhaps the lives that we all hope will be impacted by this efforts that each of us are making from our different corners of the world. Thank you to the participants also, because they asked some really great questions. And it provided for an interesting discussion. And I will now turn it over to Lara Susan to send us off.
I'm here and I have my child with me who is I think also ready to be finished with the conversation. Although I've truly so much enjoyed this that I can keep going. If I may just ask one follow-up question to Neveen's point before I wrap up is, have you had positive experiences with working with media? Because my experience with media has been almost similarly as with policymakers, and it speaks to something that Cristina had mentioned, is that it can work in both ways, but often it's also, oh, this is too complex, or this is not going to feed into what the media narrative is trying to tell. So I was just curious, or anyone else on the panel, how their experience was with media. I mean, we can always create our own space for this, right? Like we're doing this with the forum and everything. But I would just be curious if anyone had positive experiences, And if so, how they managed to have these experiences. If it was a particular outlet that was open to maybe more constructive ideas around this topic. Yeah, that would be my question. Back to you, Neveen, or anyone else. I would just be very curious personally.
I would briefly say I don't have a positive experience with media so far. I haven't tried that hard, to be honest, but I have a little hope. I have a little hope that we can maybe try to do something. I mean, I felt, but maybe what you shared, that it can be easier through media to change the narrative than do with a public policy. So that's why I had this little hope that maybe we can, through media, we start to reach the level of the top level of the policy.
Thank you, Neveen. I mean, I think absolutely media is a key stakeholder when we're talking about migration governance. It must not be forgotten at all. It's just the question is, how do we use it, right? How do we use it to communicate what we're finding from the field so it almost acts like a channel or so through which we can, share our information as well, maybe with the policymakers. Does anyone have a positive experience with media or any experience? Cristina?
I have a mixed experience in the sense that I've engaged with media a lot on the topic of Venezuelan migration. My big problem is that this issue, as every issue, is so deeply politicized, and particularly in the United States, like you will get contacted by media to feed into a particular narrative. So I feel like I'm contacted with the expectation that I will say what they want me to say. And at times, what I truly believe aligns with what I know to be the politics of the people who are contacting me. And because I am interested in putting the message out, I'll say it anyway. But I know I'm being utilized. I know I'm a pawn in somebody else's political game. And I find that deeply aggravating because I was just writing this comment, but I'll just say it with you now. The media is allergic to nuance. And the media they want a soundbite, they want just a title, and nuance is the name of the game in this kind of situations. So I completely agree that they're a key stakeholder and that we have to figure it out, because otherwise, and I'm sure every single one of you has heard this one before, we'll keep talking to each other. We'll keep talking among those of us who are already convinced, who believe what everybody else is doing is great, And in order to break through that, we definitely have to figure this one out. I haven't. I can only say that if their politics align with what you're going to say, they'll open the doors for you and give you a lot of mics. And that works sometimes, and others it's just BS.
Thank you, Cristina, for sharing your experience on this. This has been very similar in my case as well. And then the media calls just stopped when they realized that it's not going to work with me. In any case, I will deliver these closing remarks with my camera. I have my daughter in my arm, and she's been not in public discussions, so I hope that's okay with everyone, because we do want to share this recording. So I want to make sure that we can still facilitate that. Okay, so as we bring this important conversation to a close, to me, I think a key message that is clear is that migration is not a single story, and neither are the experiences of women, girls within it. We've heard today from a range of contexts, and they remind us that behind every policy framework are real lives shaped by complex and intersecting realities. We have also been reminded that while global commitments to gender responsive migration, such as included in the Global Compact for Migration, they are essential, they're not sufficient on their own. And so the true measure of progress, I would say, lies in how these commitments translate into meaningful change on the ground. And that, in turn, requires listening more intentionally to those most affected, value and lived experience as expertise, and ensuring that policy is informed not just by data, but also by context. And so to me, today's discussion really has helped bridge some of those gaps, and I truly valued all of your insights, especially also the more reflective component of today's discussion. I hope that we will continue to engage and partner and collaborate with each other, because I do believe, as Cristina said, we are in a room where we hold certain values in common, and that we need to push forward together. So whether working at the local, national, global level, I believe challenging simplified narratives is something that we need to address and to center those too often left out of decision-making spaces. So thanks also from my end to all of the speakers, to the participants for your invaluable contributions and for helping move this conversation and this work forward. And I truly look forward to staying connected with all of you. Thanks for being part of the second Global Gender and Migration Forum.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all. Thank you for
Thank
having
you
us.
all.
Thank you, everybody. Have a beautiful day. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.